Okay. Good afternoon. Today, more than 130 armed conflicts are affecting hundreds of millions of civilians worldwide. Escalating conflicts, protracted crisis, and increasing disregard for international law continue to endanger civilian lives. At the same time, the United Nations and the broader humanitarian system are undergoing profound transformation, marked by reform efforts and significant budgetary pressure. This has created a stark paradox. The need to protect civilians is growing precisely as institutional capacity and political consensus come under increasing strain. Against this backdrop, this year's Protection of Civilians Week, coordinated by UN OCHA, Center for Civilians in Conflict, International Rescue Committee, and Switzerland, asked a critical question: how do we ensure the protection of civilians amid reforms and constraints? The joint commitments to uphold the protection of civilians amid reforms and constraints seek, at least in part, to provide an answer to that question. I have the honor of reading these joint commitments on behalf of all signatories. We, 86 delegations, stand together to reaffirm that the protection of civilians must remain at the center of the United Nations peace and security, humanitarian and human rights efforts. At a time of growing needs, shrinking resources, and institutional reform, we commit to translate political will into concrete action to make civilian protection a reality on the ground. Accordingly, first, we commit to place the protection of civilians agenda as a core political priority across the United Nations system, including the Security Council, the General Assembly, and other relevant fora throughout the cycle of conflict. To this end, through our multilateral engagement, we will advance dialogue, diplomacy, mediation, and the peaceful settlement of disputes as the most effective means of protecting civilians. We will strive to prevent conflict escalation and address drivers of violence before they result in civilian harm. We will respect international humanitarian law as well as international human rights law and refugee law, and we will use our diplomatic influence to promote its respect, recognizing that respecting international law is an essential prerequisite for the protection of civilians. We will ensure timely, consistent, and decisive political action wherever civilians are at risk or suffering serious harms during armed conflict. Advocate for safe, rapid, and unimpeded humanitarian access to all civilians in need, and seek accountability for attacks on humanitarian personnel. We will also engage to ensure accountability for all violations, including by advocating for systematic investigations and prosecution of suspects, acknowledgement of harm caused, and meaningful amends to affected civilians. Second, we commit to support ongoing reform processes, including institutional restructuring and system-wide efficiency measures, with a view to strengthen rather than weaken protection outcomes for civilians. To this end, in the framework of UN80 and other reforms, we will advocate for reforms that sustain field-level protection capacities and preserve information gathering to allow for evidence-based reporting and decision-making. We will leverage ongoing discussions to strengthen protection mechanisms and further deepen synergies across the peace and security, development, and human rights pillars of the United Nations. We will support a humanitarian reset that enables principled humanitarian action with protection at its core. We will work to ensure that any changes in humanitarian financing, coordination, and operational models do not increase risks to local actors or leave vulnerable populations behind. 3, we commit to prioritize the protection of civilians in times of financial constraints and limited resources. To this end, we will strive that budget reductions and financial austerity do not undermine the protection functions and enable the adequate implementation of protection mandates. We will guide resource allocation decisions with a view to protect civilians We will strive to provide sustained, flexible, and direct funding to local and national protection actors, recognizing that they are the first to respond and the last to leave. We will promote the strategic use of limited resources to strengthen protection outcomes and pursue predictable and sustainable financing for activities that reduce harm to civilians and uphold their rights. We will repeat it as long as it is needed. Civilians must be protected. It is not only an obligation under international law, but also a moral duty. Thank you. Okay. Thank you.